Welcome to the Middle East Institute. We have, as you know, many public events, this being one that you're attending today. And we have a variety of activities here at the Middle East Institute. And in the way of public activities, you perhaps know that we had a very successful conference just very recently on Egypt. And of course, the highlight of the year, and that is our in November, our annual meeting. We also have an esteemed journal, which is, I think, known to most of you. We have a language program, which probably is the best known one here in the city. At least the price is right. But I just want to mention that there is one facility that we have here, which is perhaps less well known, but should certainly now be brought to your attention and to others, and that is we have a first-rate library with some 19,000 volumes on the Middle East. It's located right back here across the garden, and it's called the Oman Library because of generous gift to refurbish this library, really to rebuild it by the Omani government. At the end of the session, as you can rightly see, we have Steve's books. Steve has written a great many books over the years, and I've read most of them. But Steve, this is your best. It may be, you keep saying it's your last book. I don't know if it is or not, but it's certainly as far as you've gone, your best. And so it's a delight here that we have Steve with us today to talk not just about his book, but to hear some of Steve's ideas about the South Asia and the Middle East. And so before I get into anything else, let me ask Steve to come to the podium and offer some initial remarks, followed by which I'll ask him a number of questions, and then we'll open it to everyone. Steve.
I'd like to thank Ambassador Chamberlain, head of MEI, and also Marvin, who's an old friend and colleague of mine, dating back to
48 years.
48 years. Yeah, in that sense, it took me, to write this book, it took me 48 years to do the research and 2 years to actually write it. So I've been working on this book since I was actually a graduate student in India, and I first went to India in 1963, so this is the 50th anniversary, if you want to call that, of my anniversary. I was thinking of a theme. Originally, this is going to be a comparison of South Asia and Middle East peace processes. Then I guess the title was changed, but then it's gone back to that. So I want to deal with that. And this book has a number of references to Israel and Palestine and a number of points of comparison between them. But I think that if I have an overall theme, it's not in the book, but I thought of it actually on my way here. Ships that pass in the night are better than ships that collide in the night. And I could think of worse things than ships that pass in the night. And that's my view of South Asia, India, Pakistan. But I think it may be true of the Middle East. In a sense, if ships pass in the night, they don't meet each other, that's one thing. But if they collide in the night, that's something else. And I think that in the case of both regions, to some degree, the fact that they've gone nuclear, at least partially nuclear, makes a collision less likely. I'm not a believer that nuclear weapons are good, but nuclear weapons may prevent the worst from happening, and there's a long discussion of that in the book pertaining to South Asia, India, and Pakistan. Of course, in the Middle East, it's Israel and who knows who else with nuclear weapons. So I think that, and I think that the basic argument that ties the two regions together, plus other regions in the world, is that both are what I called paired minority conflicts. And I discussed that in this book. I've discussed that in previous books as well. And it's not a theory, but apparently it's moderately original. At least nobody has used that title. Where both parties to a dispute believe that they are a threatened, vulnerable minority, that they are isolated, the other side has allies, that they can do whatever they have to do to protect themselves. And when you're a minority, whether you're an ethnic minority, religious minority, whatever it is, you can do things which are beyond the pale. That is because you're threatened, your existence is threatened. I think that's true of the Israelis. I think it's true of the Palestinians. I don't know the Middle East case as much. It's certainly true of India and Pakistan, where both sides believe that they're surrounded by a more threatening country, a threatening party than you would appear. And the Indian case is interesting because it's obviously the world's second largest country, will be the world's largest country in a few years. So why do Indians have a minority complex? I learned the term actually from Shekhar Gupta, eminent Indian journalist, a number of years ago, and it was used by Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And I think there's no dominant Indian caste, there's a sense of Indian insecurity, and above all, there has been a theory propagated by Indira Gandhi that India was threatened by an alliance, an axis of evil, which included China, Pakistan, and the United States. That's why the U.S.-India nuclear deal is so important. It removes some of that psychological cloud over the relationship. And of course, Indians of a certain generation are still anti-American. They grew up with this as part of their culture. But I think, of course, this is self-explanatory in the case of the Israelis and the Palestinians, about which I know less. I will say that I learned about Palestine. I put in a commercial for a dear friend of mine who just died earlier this year, Saeed Abu Rish. Saeed and I shared a room. We're in a fraternity house together, and so my nickname, my Twitter handle is @Abu Cohen, or number Abu Cohen. And I've got a fraternity mug which says Abu Cohen on it, so I can prove that this goes back to the 1950s. And I learned a lot about the Palestinians from Saeed, who grew up in, I guess, in not Hebron, but close to Jerusalem. He told me about his family and his background. Then I read his autobiography, which filled in some of the gaps, and a remarkable guy. Some of you Middle East specialists may know his work. He did biographies of various Middle East leaders. So I think that there's parallels between the two countries, two regions. And I learned about it really from going to Sri Lanka in the 90s. I went back and forth with the Ford Foundation and other things going to Sri Lanka, and I realized that the Sinhala and the Tamils each thought that they were a threatened minority. You can understand that for the Tamils, because on the island they were a minority, but the Sinhala added up all the Tamils in the region, and if you had the Sinhala Tamils to the Indian Tamils, they were a minority. The Sinhala were a minority. So out of this came the notion of a theory, explanatory device called paired minority conflict, where both sides in the party believe that they're a threatened, vulnerable minority. And of course, if you think about what minorities do when they're pressed to the wall, or they think they're pressed to the wall, nothing can be ruled out. The rules don't apply to them. They apply to others. So that's a theory that sort of explains why the South Asia relationship is going to be enduring, and I think probably the Middle East one also. I can't be specific, but I talked to an acquaintance of mine who's involved in the current normalization peace process in Middle East. In South Asia, I call it a normalization process. I don't like the term peace process. Normalization process. He was, well, I don't want to be specific, but you're not terribly optimistic that it would lead to a successful conclusion. But I think, though, that the effort is worth trying. The book, and I did some notes for this. I'd be happy to send you my notes, go down systematically comparing the two regions. The book doesn't do that, but I've done that in some notes in preparation for this talk. So if you would like my notes, please email me, scohen@brookings.edu. I'll be happy to send them to you. So I think there's a number of points of comparison besides the paired minority phenomenon, where both sides, all parties feel that they're a threatened, vulnerable minority. But does Israel compare with India? Does it compare with Pakistan? It compares with Pakistan in that it's a homeland for a persecuted religious minority. And that's where they're really similar. And I wrote this in my first book on Pakistan called The Pakistan Army. Cleverly, it was about the Pakistan Army. And of course, Zia banned it. And he explained to me that he banned it because Pakistanis are too sensitive about the subject of Israel. But it then was published, and I think the comparison is very appropriate. Pakistanis feel and admire Israel very much so. Zia particularly admired Israel. He told me once, he said, you can be a good soldier or a good physicist, but if you're religious, you're a better soldier or a better physicist. So he thought the Israelis were really great soldiers and really great physicists. I didn't want to argue with him too much, but I said I have a different point of view. But I think that, so Israel and Pakistan, Pakistan and Israel do have this in common. Of course, India is a professedly secular state, but many Hindus in India would like to turn India into a Hindu state or a religious state. So they look at Israel with admiration also. In a sense, this debate goes on within India and, of course, between Israelis and Indians. Israel would seem to be closest to India in terms of democracy. And Israel is a democracy, but it's a partial democracy. Not all Israelis have equal rights and equal presence in the system. And of course, there's a large population of Palestinians who don't vote in Israel, they're not Israeli citizens. So that's analogous in some ways. I'll think, I don't know, this comparison is sort of strained between Israel and India. India is a functioning democracy, but there are many areas in India which are not really very democratic, especially where the military are in control or have dominant influence, say in Kashmir and some of the border areas where there's actually police or military Raj going on. So I think there's some comparisons between the two also. But I think all four countries face the same dilemma. That is, how do you create a normal relationship between two states that have different identities, different purposes, have an embedded history of hatred and dislike? Both go back to the same year, 1947. They're both the longest standing unresolved conflicts in the world. They go back, both were brought to the UN early. So there are a lot of parallels in this relationship. Ironically, there's no book that studies this or makes these comparisons. Maybe they're too obvious. Maybe I'm just pushing on an open door. There was one project, we got started, in fact, Munis, remember Munis? Professor Munis Ammar of the University of Karachi actually began a project at his university, the Karachi Institute of International, or Department of International Relations at Karachi University, which looks at the lessons of the Middle East for South Asia, or is it the lessons of South Asia for the Middle East? Anyway, he has a website, or had a website, I think it's maybe gone now, I try to find it, which compares the two. And I think there's a lot of obvious comparisons, but I don't know if anybody who's actually sit down and written this up. Maybe if somebody maybe Tino, if you'd like to take my notes and turn them into an article, we could do that. Tino Xavier was my former research assistant at Brookings. So I think that there's some similarities between the two. Both, I think, are not going anywhere fast. And while we've had to put enormous amount of American diplomatic effort into the Middle East peace process, we put nothing into South Asia, except to beat up on the Indians about Kashmir. And of that, of course, that's a no-brainer. That's a non-starter, whatever you want to call it. The Indians are not going to yield on Kashmir, although they're in trouble in Kashmir. And I think it's the wrong strategy to put Kashmir first. The Pakistanis tell us, you solve Kashmir and you solve the whole region. Kashmir is both a cause and a consequence of the conflict. It's complicated, and I devote much of a whole chapter to it. It's not as simple. It's like the West Bank or the Wailing Wall, or there's no single cause to the conflict between India and Pakistan, or between Israel and the Palestinians. Again, it's a minority and vulnerability in all four parties that drive the thing indefinitely. Now, what they do have, I think, is a common interest in ensuring that extremism, in the case of Islamic extremism, not drive the relationship over the edge. And I think that's the common purpose and common goal in both countries. If you were to draw a Venn diagram of the Israelis and the Palestinians and the Pakistanis and the Indians, I think that would be a shared agreement among all. And I think they could probably come to a consensus on that. And I think that should be the focus of diplomacy. Look for those areas of common interest and work on them as hard as you can. However, which makes me more pessimistic is what I call the blockers. Maybe like a left guard that pulls out and runs interference for the runner around as he goes around the end. In both countries, there are whole communities of people who want to block any agreement they can. They'll use terrorism, they'll use diplomacy, they'll use politics, they'll use rhetoric, they'll use any instrument they can to stop the agreement, because they don't believe that their country will be more secure, or they don't believe that the other side can be negotiated with. The other side is beyond the pale, has done horrible, terrible things. They simply cannot deal with these people. Or they will say, when the other side becomes like us, then we'll talk with them. That's the Indian position about Pakistan. I'm not sure if I don't know the Middle East well enough to draw those comparisons. And as Pakistan has become more democratic, there are Indians who then say, well, we can't talk to these weak civilians, we have to talk to this strong military. But then how do you get the militaries of a democracy and in Pakistan to talk to each other? You can't do it. So finding the right people to talk to is also difficult. I was part of a number of Track 2 dialogues, not Middle East ones, but South Asia ones for many years. And in the 90s, just when I went into the Ford Foundation for a year, I decided this is just a waste of money, huge waste of money. So I put my money, or with Ford Foundation's money, into what is the South Asia equivalent of Seeds of Peace, younger people. And we trained a generation of Indians and Pakistanis and some Chinese as well, who could talk to each other in a civil fashion, but then we couldn't get foundation funding beyond 9 or 10 years, so in a sense that dried up. I'm envious of the money that's being poured into the Middle East peace process, younger people getting them together. But again, this is a long-term investment, and I think that's another issue. Let me stop at this point, Marvin, and I think I've outlined most of my argument, and for more you can get it in the book, and thank you very much for this opportunity. Let me add that the Indian edition, this is my 4th book launch, by the way. The Indian edition has a subtitle, Finding Answers to the India-Pakistan Conundrum, which is probably better than the American edition, which just says the India-Pakistan Conundrum. But again, finding answers is more difficult than it might seem. Okay.
Thank you, Steve. I neglected to mention that, of course, Steve has been since 1998 at the Brookings Institution. And although I think maybe technically retired, how would you know?
2 books in a week. So.
Steve, the U.S. is withdrawing from Afghanistan. Do you foresee a disengagement of the United States from the region, such as we've seen in the past when our strategic interests did not seem directly threatened? Just, yeah.
Yeah, I do, and the book discusses that. It's at little length, not great length. And I think that as we pull out of Afghanistan, and as we have less of a personal human involvement in Afghanistan, fewer American military there, I think we can think strategically about the region. And clearly, from an Indian point of view and a Pakistani point of view, Afghanistan is central. The argument in the book is that both inherited the same Raj tradition. And while Indians deny Pakistan a legitimate role in Afghanistan, the Pakistanis think that the role is perfectly legitimate. They have a long border with the Afghans. And I interviewed, when I was a graduate student in London, a number of retired British generals. And they all said to me, Pakistan, the role of Pakistan was to be the defender of India and guard the frontier. And of course, it turned out to be India's greatest rival. So I think that as we pull out, we can think more strategically about South Asia as a whole. And in a sense, try to help the Indians and Pakistanis craft a role for themselves, which is not contradictory, which is supportive. The Indians do some things very, very well. Pakistanis could do other things well besides supporting the Taliban. And in a sense, that I think is one avenue towards normalization. I would begin there rather than Kashmir. I think that's going to be actually the easier thing to do, because they have a common interest in having a stable, non-ideological Afghanistan. And of course, you'd have to bring the Iranians into this as well. And I think from an American point of view, our allergy to the Iranians prevents us from talking about a regional strategy for Afghanistan. It would have to be India, Pakistan, Iran, and maybe Russia. So I think we're part of the problem in that case. We can't talk about the Iranians as a legitimate player in Afghanistan, let alone talk to the Pakistanis about an Indian role and vice versa.
Yes. Let me ask you this, Steve. Given the near parity that exists between Pakistan and India in their nuclear weapons stockpiles, does this make what you've talked in the book about a industrial-sized war, does it make it impossible? And should we nevertheless be concerned?
Yeah, I think I was told by General K. Sundarji, the author of Brass Tacks, one of India's greatest strategic thinkers, although he didn't do well in Sri Lanka, that after the Indians and Pakistanis went nuclear, and they were practically nuclear in the 90s when I talked to him, I was with Ford Foundation, he said, we can never have another war with the Pakistanis. It was like the Americans and the Soviets arguing over the Fulda Gap. Theoretically, you could have a war, but realistically, reasonable people on both sides would not go down that road. However, we've had many incidents. We had many incidents with the Soviets, many crises. Of course, there's always a possibility of a loose nuclear weapon. And the nightmare of several American presidents has been the conjunction of Islamic extremists with nuclear weapons coming out of Pakistan. So I think that nuclear weapons may contribute to stability and the avoidance of a war, but they don't lead to peace. And they have their own risk as well. If you're a nuclear weapon state, you got to face up to that risk. I think the Indians and Pakistanis do some of that, but not all of it. And of course, our Ayatollahs don't help the problem by insisting that both sign the NPT and get rid of their nuclear weapons. I think that's a silly kind of argument. I don't think we're making that policy now, are we, Rick? We don't. Yeah, there may be a few people in the the leftovers who would like to make that policy. But I think that we should use the nuclear weapons for what they're worth. That is, they may prevent industrial scale, large scale war, but they don't necessarily bring about peace. In a sense, we have to find a way where the interest of the Indians and Pakistanis overlap.
Right. If you tie the two questions together, is it this concern about the future use or whether it's transfers or the actual exchange between the, is it this that is ultimately going to keep us tied into South Asia?
I hope so, because I think the risk of transfer or collapse is greater in Pakistan than India, although India has its own vulnerabilities, as demonstrated recently by recent riots in Uttar Pradesh. So I think that will be an enduring American interest in Pakistan. We have to stay with the Pakistanis for negative reasons, that they not become the kind of broken apart state that some people would like to see. I think Indian opinion towards Pakistanis' decline and breakup has changed a lot. You get some people who still sort of wish Pakistan would blow away, but they understand that a Pakistan that was collapsing would create enormous risks for India. How do you manage those risks? How do you make sure that Pakistani nuclear weapons are under control? The state guards them, the way the Soviets did when the Soviet Union was transformed into Russia. That's the kind of transformation we need to see in Pakistan. Not necessarily the breakup of Pakistan, but the restructuring of Pakistan, including rethinking of the role of nuclear weapons.
Okay. Steve, you mentioned Kashmir, and you can't avoid talking about Kashmir when you talk about India and Pakistan. Throughout the Middle East, we see today that the United States is engaged, it's involved, it intervenes, often to try to mediate, such as particularly between Palestinians and the Israelis. What should the United States do with respect to the Kashmir dispute? There is some who have insisted that we have a role to play, others not. What do you see as the pluses and minuses? Should we be more deeply engaged in trying to find an end to this dispute?
No, because if we do, that's going to alienate the Indians and disappoint the Pakistanis. In a sense, would say one way or the other, and I would leave it to Wendy and her former diplomatic colleagues and Rick, a way of crafting an American policy which said, all of you agree in the region that the line of control is going to be the ultimate border between the two. We leave it up to you to find a solution to that problem. How do you get from here to there? And stop at that point. We don't want to start drawing lines for them. This will disappoint a lot of Pakistanis who think that Kashmir is reversible, but I think would ease pressure on the Indians who have their own problems in Kashmir. So I don't think that should be an area of American diplomatic emphasis. Certainly we can, I think Afghanistan is the opportunity for us right now.
Would you accept the idea that maybe Kashmir, rather than being the key to solving the differences between the two countries, as most people would suggest, should come not at the beginning of the process of reconciliation, but rather at the end of the process? That is, that there would have to be a change in the structure of the relationship between the two countries, at which time then Kashmir becomes soluble.
Agree totally. Yeah. I think that's right.
Okay. Traditionally, Steve, the course of bilateral relations between India and Pakistan has been determined by their elites. It's been elites to elites. In the case of Pakistan, it's the military leadership. In the case of India, it's been more the civilians with military input. But your book suggests that perhaps now there's been a change, that it's become much more complicated than something which can just be between elites, that there are new voices, that there are new players, and that indeed it may very well be that the elites now, in a more bottom-up fashion, have to be listening to others.
That's true, and I think that the major change in Pakistani opinion has been that Pakistani civilians, many of them, not all of them, but many of them believe that, or respect and admire what India's done economically. They would like to see Pakistan trail after India. The analogy I make when I talk to Pakistani audiences is that Pakistan should see itself as South Korea, competing with Japan. As the Japanese move ahead, the South Koreans are moving up on Japan, as the Japanese are moving up on the US. So in a sense, that kind of economic competition is healthy. However, that took place in East Asia under the American strategic umbrella. And you don't have that in South Asia at all. Although now we have a relationship with India that we never had before. In a sense, we're in a position now where the Indians look to us to influence the Pakistanis and vice versa. To that degree, we should use our influence to encourage normalization and dialogue between the two states. But I'm not optimistic that this is going to happen, or that we see the problem this way. I think our bureaucracies are so frozen in even Cold War structures that we can't do it organizationally, even if we wanted to. And any American president that wanted to make South Asia the focus of his policy would simply lose right away to the Middle East and maybe to East Asia. It can't compete. It can't compete unless there's another series of crises. It can't compete for presidential attention.
So how important is public opinion?
It's in India, in Pakistan, the military are beginning to rethink the relationship with India, although I wouldn't call them pro-Indian at all. I think they would be willing to accept a realistic settlement with India. In the case of the case of Pakistan. In the case of India, there's a younger group of civilians, I think, that have been traumatized by the terrorist attacks. And I think Mumbai served to educate a generation of Indians that Pakistan was a real enemy. And this is what I mean by blockers. Anytime they get close to an agreement, as they were, or in a dialogue, then a terror attack takes place. And I think these terror attacks are designed to break up the normalization process. And that's true on both sides, because there have been Indian attacks of extreme Hindus on Muslims in India, as well as Pakistani attacks in India. So I think any normalization process has to take into account the fact that there's likely to be a terror attack or two or three as the process moves forward. And I'm not sure whether the process can withstand that.
Well, but what I'm getting at, Steve, does public sentiment now that we have social media, that we have in Pakistan, probably a freer press than in India, in a sense that we certainly have a much more diversified kind of press there. Is that in any way driving the players themselves, the decision makers?
I think it's harder for governments in both countries to make policies because they have to be attentive to a public opinion that didn't exist a couple of years ago. And General Kiani told me when I last saw him about 3 years ago, he said, if things have changed, we cannot simply decide to do something and do it. They've got a public opinion to deal with, whether it's Twitter, or whether it's Facebook, or whether it's flash mobs. And the army has its own way of dealing with these things or trying to structure them. But clearly, this inhibits policymakers in both countries. So maybe as the press frees up and becomes more open and ways of communicating expand in both countries, governance is simply harder to do. I think that's true in the U.S. also. Governance is simply harder to do everywhere.
Finally, because I would like to have everybody else jumping in here, what would you advise the Pakistanis with respect to the post-14 period in Afghanistan? I think everybody agrees that the destinies of these two countries are totally bound together, and that no country can gain more or lose more by what happens in Afghanistan. So what would you give in the way of advice for Pakistan as it looks ahead? Should it be try to gain a friendly? Well, let me ask you.
I'm not a specialist on Afghanistan. You're the expert, Marvin. But I would say that in terms of the larger relationship with India and their larger role in Afghanistan, what could Iran do? What could India do in Afghanistan that would be in Pakistan's interests? And what could Pakistan not do in Afghanistan that would be in their interest? In other words, what policies and strategies create overlapping interest? And I would say that Iran has a role to play in Afghanistan. The Indians have a role to play in Afghanistan. Well, from a Pakistani point of view, give me a list of things that these countries could do, of things that the U.S. could do, and show me the list. And depending on what that list looked like, I could answer your question.
Okay, so I'll take questions. This gentleman right here in front. Please Please stand if you would, unless it's difficult, and introduce yourself.
Yeah, Mohammed Hussaini from the Arab League.
Do we have a, just wait for the mic.
I think they will hear.
I'm sorry?
They will hear me. So. Mohammed Hussaini from the Arab League. I really have a difficulty in seeing the parallel or the comparison, the Pakistani and Indian and then Israel and Palestine. Here is a country which possesses nuclear power, the others don't possess. Here is a country that has defied international law and Security Council resolution. Here is a country where the United States is committed to protect against all the Arabs combined at any time, which I mean Israel, of course. How can you find, I don't find the parallel really. And the minority issue also, I don't know in Palestine or in Israel who is the minority and who is the majority. Thank you.
Yeah, no, there's no exact comparison between any of these countries. If I inferred that, I'm wrong. You misheard me. I think that there's some parallels between them, but no exact parallels. In the case of the nuclear issue, I think that one of the American objectives in the Middle East is to prevent a nuclear war in the Middle East, which is why we're working on the Iraqi and Iranian nuclear programs. And of course, Israel's nuclear weapon program seems to be, it goes under the radar. The three countries that did not sign the NPT that are nuclear weapon states, Israel, Pakistan, and India, they form a unique class. And the Indians and the Pakistanis, the Indians have been admitted to a sort of halfway house. I'd like to see the Israelis volunteer to say, we'll be in a halfway house also. We're declared nuclear weapon state, but we haven't signed the NPT. But how can, we will demonstrate restraint in our nuclear weapons. The Israeli strategy is more to demonstrate ambiguity as to whether they have them or not. But I think that inhibits the Arab states from attacking Israel, which in a sense it creates an overall sense of peace in the region, or non-war in the region. Peace is not the same as non-war. That's why I don't like the term peace process. It's actually a non-war process. So I think the Israelis are inhibited from, there won't be a likely major war involving Israel because they do have a nuclear weapon.
Okay, over here.
Dana Marshall with the Transnational Strategy Group. Good to see you again, Steve. Wanted to draw you out a little bit on the economic dimension. You talked a bit about this. I'm a great believer, although hopefully not a naive believer, in peace through commerce. We see examples, if you want to use the parallel, although it's imperfect, as the ambassador mentioned. We have this QIZ program that has attempted for the last 20 years to bring Israel and Egypt, Israel and Jordan, Israel and Palestinian authorities together, and it's working very well, even in the worst situation between Egypt and Israel over the last few years. Commerce was one of the few channels that kept it together. The same can be said for Israeli-Turkish relations, although that has occurred without any U.S. involvement. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, if you were, maybe the way to put the question in a bit of a dramatic way, if you were writing the talking points for the two prime ministers this weekend, what is the agenda on building commerce, and where are the obstacles, and how do we co-opt those obstacles? Because we're talking about money after all, so it should be fairly easy to see. How do we sort of overcome those obstacles from a financial perspective to move forward on some sort of an economic dimension to bringing the countries together?
Yeah, the two prime ministers of India and Pakistan, who may meet briefly in the UN Assembly. I don't know. I would say carry through the agreements you've already made. In a sense, neither country has fulfilled the agreements it's already made, especially in terms of trade and commerce. Let me go back to a larger point, Dana, and because I discuss this in the book. To my knowledge, there's no comprehensive overview of strategies for normalization. I won't say peace, but normalization. In the literature, and I looked at the literature, being a political scientist, I had to look at the literature. There seems to be two kinds of literatures. There's a peace literature, which begins with economic and people-to-people normalization. And there's a strategic literature, which begins with high-level dialogue between elites. And so one is bottom-up. You get trade and commerce and people-to-people movement between governments or countries, and the other is top-down. 6 guys sit around a table, they're always guys, sit around a table and say, it's in our interest to have peace, and from that, everything else flows. Clearly, you need both bottom-up and top-down. And in Middle East and South Asia had neither. And the economic trade and the people-to-people diplomacy, seas of peace, so forth, are bottom-up. And the theory is that if you have enough people like that, and the business community itself would be a lobby for normalization, they would put pressure on the strategic elites. The strategic elites I've talked to don't care about that pressure. They're willing to see their country go under if they can outlast the other side. This is like a potlatch where each side believes that it can spend more than the other side. And that's the quality of these disputes. Each side can hurt the other. If they believe that they can hurt the other side more than they're hurt, they're willing to take the pain indefinitely. So far, they've taken the pain for 65 years. So they have a theory that seems to work, for them at least. But I think you have to understand the thing in terms of theory. That is, the theory is both strategies have to work at the same time. In terms of what I'd advise the prime ministers, I'd say carry through in the agreements you've already made. Halfway through writing this book, about a year and a half ago, they reached an agreement on trade and trade normalization. Well, they still haven't done anything. So I'd say, well, finish the agreements you already agreed to. But I think the problem is smugglers who form a big lobby in both countries don't want to see normalization take place. They make a huge profit going through the Middle East, and people want to block the relationship, who believe that we can suffer the pain more than you can suffer the pain. That's a quality of these disputes. I can take the pain more than you can take the pain. They believe the other side is just about to crack and to break up. And you have these fantasists in Pakistan who believe that India is about to dissolve itself, and vice versa. And you get ideologues in all four countries that say, well, the other country is an unnatural country. How can it survive? This sustains the process. And my point is, the reviews of my book in India, Pakistan, Cohen predicts 100 years of conflict. Not true. I predict it only lasts 35 years more, which would be 100 years. And so in a sense, only 35 years to go. The finish line is not that far. So we celebrate 100th anniversary in the Middle East and South Asia of this great, wonderful, conflict. Two conflicts. Right? I think they could learn from each other in a sense that they've tried lots of things in each region, and some have worked and some haven't worked. But essentially, they're digging their hole in both regions even deeper. That's a metaphor I prefer. Yeah, the first rule of holes is when you're in a hole, stop digging. But they think they can dig faster than the other side.
Right?
Thank you. Great to be here. I'm Rick Enderfirth. I'm at CSIS.
The new CSIS.
I'm sorry?
The new CSIS.
The new CSIS, 1616 Rhode Island Avenue. Please come by and see us. We're right up the corner here. Let me sort of play off the Middle East, South Asia thing for a second, Steve, and maybe even throw in U.S. and China. With the Middle East, it took two individuals, in this case, Sadat and Begin. Sadat being the visionary and Begin being the realist, that the time was right for Egypt and Israel. For U.S.-China, it was Nixon and Mao. Big leaders can sometimes do things and move nations forward, even if things slip back after they have made their efforts. Right now, we've got the meeting, actually it's now scheduled on September 29th of Sharif and Manmohan Singh. Both have made it clear that they want to open up a normalization process. They both want to pursue it. But the question is whether or not Sharif is in a position with what he's doing as Prime Minister again, and the economy and the rest, and especially with Manmohan Singh going into the elections, is there any juice there left for him? Will he accept an invitation, which I'm sure will be extended again, to come to Pakistan? I hope he does, before he leaves office. My question is, leadership will be terribly important, whether it's a peace process or a normalization process. Where is the leadership? Where is the strength and the courage to be shown? Will it take something very strange? I mean, if Mr. Modi becomes prime minister, might he be the Nixon to China? I mean, what is your thinking about the personalities, where they are, and what we can expect in terms of their driving a process, and hopefully supported by the people?
Good question, Rick. I spent 2 years faking it as a State Department official before you were in the policy planning staff, and I learned the importance of personality. Reagan was my president, not my president, but he was elected president. But I worked for George Shultz, really, and Shultz prevented a lot of bad things from happening. Sometimes that's all good leaders can do, is prevent bad things from happening. But I think what did happen was we normalized with the Soviets. And I remember in the State Department reading all kinds of stuff that somehow Reagan was a leftist communist, that he wanted to sell out to Gorbachev. That was astonishing stuff coming from his own people. And but then he came up with trust but verify. And I translated that into Hindi, Sanskrit, Urdu, and whatever it is, all the South Asian languages I could do, and I've got it somewhere in my file. Trust but verify. I think one of the critical problems all the leaders face is that they have to trust the other side. Well, I think Reagan had it exactly right. And the problem is that they don't trust their own intelligence services. I'm not sure what ISI is telling the Prime Minister of Pakistan or the military of Pakistan, or what RAW is telling their counterparts in India, but clearly, and that's where the U.S. could play a role. In a sense, if there, maybe we could provide some kind of verification technology or information, or have a neutral panel of disinterested experts from other parts of the world, which say that, your trade will, if you do this in trade, your economic benefits will be this, this, and this. And that's about all you can do, but clearly give the political leadership a reason to go ahead and come to agreements. And because they can't trust their own experts. And I think in both India and Pakistan, some of their experts are trying to sabotage the agreement. I know South Asia better than the Middle East, but I imagine the same thing's happening in the Middle East. Yeah.
Steve, would you agree, though, that in Nawaz Sharif, as the recently elected prime minister, Pakistan probably has the strongest, as far as that goes, committed person to improving relations with India?
Well, when Nawaz got elected, I read an article by Ahmed Rashid, who said there's a new Nawaz. Then just today I read another article by Ahmed Rashid, who said the new Nawaz isn't producing anything. He's just stuck, can't do anything. So, I take Ahmed with a big grain of salt on these issues. But who knows what's going to happen with Nawaz and with Manmohan. Maybe Rahul will take a lead and emerge and tell his mother that we've got to normalize with Pakistan. It's in my self-interest as well as India's self-interest. I don't know. I think here's where we get personalities in the play. I do know that I've talked to a number of Indian leaders, and some of them, even on the BJP side, have a remarkably foresighted view of the region. And I think that from the BJP point of view, at least some of them, I don't know about Modi because he's kind of mum on this issue. The fact that China is a major player in South Asia is an enormous strategic loss for India. In a sense, the Indian dilemma is how can they offer Pakistan more than China can offer Pakistan? Now, do they have to give up Kashmir? Well, that's unacceptable. But what can they do other things that would persuade the Pakistanis that their interests lie with a good relationship with India? I think that's how it should be seen in India. Not that we want to sell the store out to the Pakistanis, who, frankly, haven't run their own store very well, but other arrangements, especially in Afghanistan, where the Pakistanis come out ahead, India comes out ahead, and the Chinese sort of are observers. And I think the Chinese might even go along with this because they're very much concerned about radicalization of Pakistan. I think it's analogous to some things that are happening in the Middle East, but again, I wouldn't want to venture into that region at all. I do think that we may get an agreement in the Middle East. Somebody's told me, which bypasses democratization in the Middle East. So the question is, do you want peace or do you want democracy? Or do you want peace now and then democratize later? I think you have to think about sequencing relationship. So we got all the non-democracies lined up with us in the case of Syria. Are we interested in getting a stable, peaceful Syria and then normalize Syria under the Assad regime? Or do we want to push for democratization of Syria, which may never happen? So I think you need to think in terms of sequencing, and that's true of the India-Pakistan relationship. Do we want a democratic Pakistan or do we want a peaceful Pakistan? I would rather have a peaceful Pakistan that could be evolved towards democracy later. I think peace, avoidance of war is more important in the circumstances under which Pakistan democracy might happen. Yeah.
Of course, there's democracy and democracy. Yeah. I think that one of the most interesting concepts here is the idea that you need, before you have democracy, or you need constitutionalism. You've got to establish here understanding here, particularly with regard to tolerance of minorities, and this has to be built into it legally and also in terms of the political culture. And otherwise, what you get in democracy, and my God, in the 18th century they recognized this, what you get so often is a kind of democratic tyranny or mobocracy. And we're seeing elements of this, so that what we really mean here is constitutional democracy. We have a question. I understand. I'll take your question in a moment. We have from the overflow room. Do you want to read that? Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. So it's from Bobby Godachok, co-founder of Seeds of Peace. Since 2001, Seeds of Peace has brought together South Asians, Afghans, and Middle Easterners. They do learn from one another and share many commonalities. What are the commonalities which could draw both sides of each conflict together?
Yes. I wish Seeds of Peace was more active in South Asia. I didn't know that they were involved South Asians in this. But again, does this mean 4 or 5 high school students brought to Massachusetts for a nice summer, or does it mean real meetings among counterparts in different countries? I'm not sure whether the relevance of Seeds of Peace for South Asia, or orchestras that play in Kashmir, bringing the Song of Peace to Kashmir. Marvelous episode where I guess the BSO Bavarian Symphony Orchestra went up to Kashmir. It almost caused a riot up there, but certainly caused the riot in the management of the BSO. So I'm in favor of these things. I think they're all good, but I wouldn't assume that that's the only road to normalization or peace. I think that you have to get the strategists thinking in terms of hard national interest. What are my vital national interests? What are the 3 things I can't give up, but what are the 5 things I could compromise on, and get them to talk about those things. I think in India, Pakistan, and I don't know, again, I'm out of my field in Palestine, Israel, but I think there are common areas of interest, one of which I think is the rise of Islamic extremism. There's the notion of revolutionary Islam, which I think threatens many Palestinians as well as it threatens Israel, India, and Pakistan. And I think that's answer my question.
Yes,
Let me say that I'm not the Steve Cohen that Tom Friedman quotes all the time. I'm another Steve Cohen, or the Russian Steve Cohen.
There are several.
I'm the South Asia Steve Cohen.
Thank you,
Or
Marvin.
the porn king Steve Cohen. Yeah.
My name is Vijay Saswal with Kashmir Forum. Nice to you. I guess I go back to Kashmir. And you made a very interesting observation in my view, which is that at the end of the day, the solution lies along formalizing the international boundary more or less along the line of control. I think everybody accepts it, but it's difficult to swallow in Pakistan because they have had a long-standing. But Pakistan always has also been saying that they would rather have the solution come through United Nations. And I begin to think that could be the cover that they would receive if, for example, you read my paper where I suggest it should be UNSC that directs it. Then India definitely will be a party, we know, and Pakistan gets a cover in terms of the fact, hey, I didn't do it, I'm being forced by the higher level authorities.
Vijay, I agree with you totally. But let me say that my definition of peace in Kashmir, settlement of Kashmir, and I've written this for many years now. That shows how old I am and how old the conflict is. When the Kashmiri pundits return to the valley, greeted by their Muslim neighbors. In a sense, you have to have internal normalization in India and Kashmir. You can't simply have draw a line and say that's it. And I think that's part of the process of human reconciliation. But I agree that a UN vote might be the final format in which the Indians can do it and Pakistan could do it, sort of a face-saving device.
Yeah, I think the point that Marvin made about constitutional democracy, I think that discussion is going on, because right now, since you raised the question of Kashmiri pundits, and I didn't, but I'm going to tell you that the state government there has very steadfastly refused really to create the space for them to return. All they want to do is give them a check for 5 lakhs and say, you're on your own. Now, that's never going to happen. Thank you.
When we talk about constitutional democracy, let me just say one thing more. We're talking about creating a constitution, which, as I mentioned, tolerance and so on, but also building in checks and balances and so on, and that should precede elections. Elections then have to be in the context of that kind of understanding which a constitution creates. Let's see now, over here. Oh, yeah, okay, I'm sorry. All right, please.
My name is Aman Khan, and I'm from Warrenton, Virginia. And I'm a former staffer from Pakistan Embassy in Washington, D.C. Now a retired businessman. And I enjoy attending think tanks, listen to a member of the intelligence here like you. My question with you is that you talk about India's nuclear program, that it was necessary for them. what do you think about Pakistan's nuclear program matching the missile technology? My other question is that relatively less noticed carnage in Kashmir continues. India opportunistically has used this umbrella of the much touted war on terror to castigate the cause of Kashmir. It's the similar as the cause in Palestinian issue. But I don't think that Kashmiri can accept that this is it, that India has the, as an integral part of India, Kashmir.
Well, some Kashmiris, number of people I know well, do not want to leave India. They want to stay in India. In fact, they want to be ruled not from Srinagar, but from New Delhi. From New Delhi. The Ladakhis, some Hindus, they don't want to be part of Kashmir, a Muslim-dominated Kashmir. There's a Kashmiri minority problem. Hindus and Buddhists in Kashmir, and in a sense, they need the protection of New Delhi. So it's a complicated issue. I don't want to get into a great detailed discussion on the nuclear issue. I think that now that they've both gone nuclear, they're about where we and the Soviets were in the 1950s. We can kill about 50 or 100 million people each. Now they can kill maybe 50 million each. And the question I have for Indian and Pakistani strategists is how much is enough? How many of the other party do you feel comfortable with? How many do you have to kill to feel secure? I have to kill 10 million Pakistanis or 50 million Indians. What makes you feel secure? The problem is this is a psychological thing between these two appendages. It's all psychological. So, and whereas the military-industrial complex in both countries, especially Pakistan, their motto is more is enough, more is enough. They simply build and build and build as we and the Soviets did. So I think they have to think more realistically about what nuclear deterrence is. They have to understand that if you kill 50 or 100 million Indians or Pakistanis, that should be enough. And then you can stabilize it at that level. Now, Indians have resisted this for many years. Rajiv Gandhi did have the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan, which included a regional dialogue. And just simply recently, C.R. Garikhan, an eminent Indian diplomat, came up, revived the idea. But I'm very disappointed the Indian thinking about nuclear weapons, that they don't understand that more may not be enough. You know, a few is good enough. That is, wipe out the city, 5 or 6 Pakistani citizens. That's enough to deter Pakistan. And the same is true for Pakistanis who are going to the theory of limited nuclear war to counter so-called cold start. That's fantasy. That's what we and the Soviets did for 50 years. And it's not going to get them anywhere. It simply digs the hole deeper. And they spend more and more on nuclear weapons without increasing their security. Because the more nuclear weapons you have, the greater risk there is of theft or loss or accidental detonation. That's a serious issue for both countries as well as for all nuclear weapon states.
So the fact is that having nuclear power in both countries created peace between Pakistan and India?
No, it's normalization but not peace. That is, it's prevented an industrial scale war. But it hasn't prevented the possibility, low possibility, but high consequence of an accidental nuclear war or escalation to a nuclear war. I've written a lot on this. This book has some of it, and I've written other things on it. So there's 2 risks that they haven't really grappled with. That is, escalation during a conflict, which could lead to nuclear use, or else an accidental theft of a nuclear weapon. And in a sense, from an outside point of view, you have to trust them to do the right thing, but we'll only know if they make a mistake when a nuclear weapon goes off. And hopefully it won't go off in our country, go off in one of their countries. Yes?
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm Dr. Nisar Chaudhry. And I will not say it's good to see you today. It's always good to see you. And I'm very glad to see so many friends together. It's just wonderful. You mentioned about Pakistan and mentioned the Pakistani sensitivity, or there are sensitive Pakistanis. I think we'll also add the word sensitive as well as sensible Pakistanis. That will do even better. And about the stability and peace in these tri-state areas like India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, I think both these things are interdependent. All these 3 countries, for peace and stability, when it comes to peace and stability, it's like a Bermuda Triangle. And I think all these 3 countries have to work together to bring peace and stability in the region. My question to you is, since you have brought many common things between Israel and Pakistan, they were created on the basis of religion and a religious minority. Then they had been dealing with militancy throughout. They have hardly seen peace in their entire life. Both are nuclear, and if you trace back the history, they are first cousins also. What would you recommend? And they don't have any border dispute also. How can these two countries, would you recommend, be brought together or closer, or reconcile and become friends to each other and work together?
Well, I wouldn't shoot for the goal of friends. I would shoot for the goal of not planning to invade the other, or not planning to use nuclear weapons against it, or not planning covert operations in the other. I think that would satisfy me. But I think that the kinds of things you've done, bringing Pakistani doctors to India and vice versa, are really important. That sort of track 2 diplomacy of various sorts. That at the popular level, track 2 level. But again, it's up to the leadership in both countries, the strategists and even the military in both countries, to think, where is my common interest overlap with his common interest? If you have no overlap at all, then forget about it. The conflict is going to last forever. But do they have a shared interest in a stable, normal Afghanistan? They both say they do. What I'd like to see the Indian list about what Pakistan could do, and the Pakistani list about what India could do, and maybe get together and talk about that list as a starting point, and what other countries could do as well. And what should the American role be in Afghanistan after 2014? What would the Indians say? What would the Pakistanis say? I think we have a legitimate role there. But again, I'm not sure exactly whether that role would be compatible with their roles in Afghanistan. Certainly the Indians are doing some useful things. The Pakistanis are mostly supporting the Taliban. Can Pakistan do something else and support the Taliban, in terms of helping a stable Afghanistan? These Pakistan-Afghanistan dialogues are very good, very useful. And Mushahid, a friend of mine, Mushahid Singh, was in Afghanistan, Kabul the other day, and came up with a good statement about the dialogue. I think these have to be extended and broadened between Pakistan and Afghanistan, because there's so much suspicion between the two countries.
Okay, yeah, go here.
Hello and good afternoon. My name is Tanaz Mohammed, and I'm here from the Center for International Study and Development. And my question is, whereas Pakistan has one issue going on one side of the border with India in regards to whole Kashmir conflict, there's the other issue with Afghanistan on the other side, with the Durand Line, which hasn't received much attention. Do you see any parallels with the Durand Line and the whole Kashmiri conflict? One. And my second question is, with the current movements and initiatives led by the Pashtuns of Pakistan on the other side, trying to push away and separate from Pakistan, do you see any worsening situations in Pakistan overall?
I'm not going to comment on the last question because I haven't been there for a couple of years. I'm not sure. I don't have a fine grade understanding of Pakistan. On the first question, the border dispute, let me quote you a passage from Jaswant Singh's new book. I wrote a foreword to it, or blurb for it. And Jaswant, who's a very eminent former Indian minister of defense, foreign minister, finance minister, he's done everything there is to do in India. Probably won't become prime minister, but he's an eminent guy. And he negotiated the U.S.-India nuclear deal with Strobe Talbot. Jaswant says, and I can't find another reference to it, and I think this may be Jaswant's idea, that a lot of the present-day problems are due to the collapse of several empires, including the Ottoman Empire, which sort of set off a search in the Islamic, so-called Islamic world for the new Caliphate, including the British Empire, which set off boundary disputes between India and Pakistan, including the Chinese Empire, the Qin dynasty, which set off boundary disputes between China and its neighbors. And there's a period of 100 years where China had borders imposed on it. So in a sense, we're dealing with the residue of history. And how do we deal with this residue initially? Not seriously, but I've argued that maybe somebody should look at normalizing all the borders of South Asia, because they stretch from Afghanistan, Pakistan, all the way around India, China, and say, what are the causes of the dispute? Are these, is this simply short-sightedness on the part of leaders, or these have historic roots? And I think if people understood the origins of these disputes deep in history, the collapse of empires, really that might lead to clear thinking about these in both countries. Because right now people defend the borders as if they're inviolable and holy. You cannot alter your border under any circumstance. In fact, borders used to be traded and swapped all the time. And maybe we need to go back to an era where, especially with nuclear weapons, where the alignment of the borders is less important than the fact that you've got an agreed upon border. India's trying to do this with Bangladesh, which is the result of another dispute, the 1970 India-Pakistan war.
Well, we've reached that 1 o'clock hour when we are officially going to wind up. And of course, Steve will be here for book signing, and also, I imagine, also to answer any questions that you have. So we welcome you to do so. Stay around if you'd like, and let's show our appreciation to Steve this afternoon.